So I left off on the previous lecture segment with this slide, and we're going to start here. This is carbohydrate catabolism, or glucose oxidation is the topic here. All organisms oxidize carbohydrates, and what that means is they break them apart down to the carbon dioxide, and that helps them to extract energy from the bonds of those carbohydrates, and they can transfer that energy to make ATP, and this is true of all organisms. Glucose is the most common carbohydrate that is oxidized, and you learn about carbohydrate oxidation in Biology 1406, and I know you really loved that part of Biology 1406 when you had to memorize all the parts of respiration, but in fact it's really, really important. We're not going to memorize all those parts again, but I do expect you to know that the oxidation of glucose is a very fundamental metabolic process for all organisms, and it's catalyzed by enzymes, and you know what factors affect enzymes in general, and those factors come into play with glucose oxidation. And we're going to hit on a few types of glucose oxidation. The main types are cellular respiration, and that can be either aerobic, meaning with oxygen involved in the process, or anaerobic, meaning no oxygen involved in the process. And by oxygen, I mean atmospheric oxygen, O2. And the other process is called fermentation. But all of these things are versions of glucose oxidation, and the main point is to get the energy out of the glucose and put it into ATP, which is the type of energy the cell prefers, and also GTP. So this picture shows a very broad overview or summary of glucose oxidation. And you can see here at the top, you start with glucose. You may recall there are 10 enzymatic steps called glycolysis that breaks down the glucose into 2-pyruvic acid, or pyruvate. And then at that point, the pyruvic acid will either be fermented, or the pyruvic acid will go into a respiration pathway like the Krebs cycle. So the pyruvic acid is common to both fermentation and respiration. And at that point, depending on which enzymes are present and what organism it is, then it might go into a fermentation pathway, or it might go into a respiration pathway. But ultimately, either way, some ATP is made. Now, a lot more ATP is made by the respiration pathway. Only a little bit of ATP is made in fermentation. But the goal of all of this is for the cell to get ATP. Now, the goal for humans sometimes is to get some of these end products. For example, humans like some of the waste products of fermentation. Alcohol is a waste product for the yeast, for example, but to us it is desirable. The yeast is trying to make ATP, but it also makes alcohol in the process. So, and then if the pyruvic acid, if the organism does respiration, then you get a lot more ATP out of that. So a little bit of ATP made in glycolysis, a little bit of ATP made if there's fermentation, but a lot more ATP is made during respiration. So you probably recognize this basic overview here. You probably remember the NADH in some capacity, the FADH2, carbon dioxide is released, and so on. I'm not going to test you over all the parts again. But at the very end of the respiration pathway, there is something called the final electron acceptor. If the final electron acceptor is oxygen, then we call this aerobic respiration. If the final electron acceptor is something else like sulfur, then we call it anaerobic respiration. But either way, you get a lot of ATP from this. Fermentation is a much shorter process and you don't get very much ATP. But there are some organisms that only have the enzymes for this fermentation process, and therefore they are limited in only being able to do fermentation. So just a quick review. There's glycolysis, that's the splitting of the glucose, and you end up with pyruvic acid or pyruvate. Then you have a couple more steps, sometimes called the production of acetyl-CoA or the oxidation of pyruvate, but that acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle, and then the NADH and the FADH2 go through electron transport, chemiosmosis, and oxidative phosphorylation, and that will generally produce somewhere in the 30 to 36 ATPs, depending. Fermentation, though, is, like I said, some organisms have to do fermentation, and you get a lot less ATP from that. All right. So you don't need to, I guess the thing you need to know here is that aerobic respiration would require atmospheric oxygen, O2. Anaerobic respiration does not require atmospheric oxygen, and fermentation does not require it. And then the other thing is what is the final electron acceptor? If it's aerobic respiration, it's oxygen. If it's anaerobic respiration or fermentation, it's not oxygen. And generally, we don't get too picky on the numbers, but respiration in general can generate in the 30s in terms of ATP, and fermentation doesn't even get close. But what's interesting about fermentation are the various products that you can get from it. So we're thinking more in economic terms. Remember that Pasteur started a field of biology that's microbiology that's industrial, meaning to produce products that you can sell. And so some products that are made by fermenting organisms can be sold. So ethanol can be sold. Different alcohols can be made by fermenters. Ethanol is one of the most common, and you'll remember that the winemakers were very interested in microbiology back in Pasteur's day, and ethanol is a type of alcohol that you drink. Lactic acid is also, for some organisms, is the product. So some organisms make lactic acid, other organisms make alcohol. It depends on the species. But depending on the species, then you can get different products from microbes. So you can get cheese, you can get things like soy sauce, yogurt, alcohol, we talked about ethanol, from Saccharomyces, which is just a yeast. And one thing I think is interesting is, remember Clostridium, which is one of our endospore formers. And Clostridium there are some species that are dangerous, but there are also some species that we use to make other types of alcohol that we don't drink. So isopropanol is an alcohol, it's rubbing alcohol. And then acetone is in nail polish removers. So it's interesting that some species of these microbes are dangerous. Some of them are really useful. Some of them you even take internally, and they are probiotics is what we call them. So in yogurt, for example. So lactobacillus is in yogurt. So we have a lot of products that we get from fermentation. And so for the organism, fermentation is to produce some ATP, but for us it is to produce these other things that we consider useful. All right, also you studied photosynthesis in your 1406 class, and the concept of photosynthesis is that organisms that are what we sometimes call producers can convert light energy into the carbohydrates, the glucose. Then respiration converts the energy in the glucose into the ATP. So photosynthesis is another process, but not all organisms can do this one. All organisms can do some kind of glucose oxidation, either respiration or fermentation. But not all organisms can do photosynthesis. But the sugar that's made from photosynthesis is needed by all organisms. And you may remember that there are reactions that occur on membranes called the thylakoids. And what's interesting is thylakoid membranes are inside the chloroplast, but there are photosynthetic bacteria that also have thylakoid membranes. And that sort of violates one of our rules. We had a rule, I think you would say it was a rule, that prokaryotes can't have internal membranes, but this is an exception. So prokaryotic organisms that are photosynthetic have these infolded membranes. They're basically plasma membrane that's folded inward a little bit and has the chlorophyll embedded on it. So it's not an organelle, but it's just an infolded membrane that kind of has folded into the cell that contains the chlorophyll. So that's where photosynthesis would happen in a prokaryotic cell. And this slide you definitely don't need to memorize. This is just a combination of that earlier slide where I showed cellular respiration here, and it's tying in photosynthesis. You don't need to memorize all this, but all of the metabolism, this is all the well, it's not all of the metabolism, but this is some of the basic metabolism of organisms shown as a map. But all the metabolism is integrated. It's all connected. Something that's a product of one process becomes a reactant for another process. Right? But the energy is not recycled. The actual atoms are recycled and reused, but the energy is not cycled.